And we are back. As the climate changes, our cities face numerous challenges, from rising temperatures to increased flooding. High temperatures, especially at night, exacerbate health risks. They raise energy costs and make cities less livable. Urban areas are particularly vulnerable to the materials used in their infrastructure, which absorb and retain heat. We have now joining us the Senior Program Director at Metropolitan AME Church, Reverend John Robinson. And Reverend Robinson, good to have you.
Good to be here. Thank you, Darren. This is a great opportunity.
Thank you. And so, talk to us about, when we talk about community, obviously you're right there in Harlem. Talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing.
So, the church I serve is in Washington, D.C., which is not unlike many urban areas, which is experiencing profound inequities and disparities, whether we're talking about health, climate, education, economics. And I think part of the challenge for us is in understanding that these conditions did not just arise out of nowhere. We are experiencing what we're experiencing. All of the things that you outlined in the intro and the lead in as a result of intentional, targeted, and focused public policy. So, what we're seeing is the result of generations of public policy that has been designed to cause harm to people of color.
And when we talk about what's going on with people of color, obviously we know that sometimes that's the short end of the stick due to many systemic inequalities, as we talked about. How do you break down the inequalities you see it from your perspective?
So, part of the playbook, I think, is a playbook that is given to us by our ancestors. If you look at the course of human history, every advancement towards justice, every incremental gain that has been made has been the result of sustained, targeted action led by ordinary people, in a lot of cases led by young people who push institutions, push companies, push governments, push institutions of higher learning towards more just and equitable ways of being in the world.
When we talk about, you know, ecologically, and we see that there's a disparity. Hard not to look at it and say, listen, there's rising disparities that go on. The awareness issue is very critical. How do we do a better job of making people aware? Because I think there's some day to day things that we just take for granted.
Yeah, so part of it is helping folks to make the connections, as you mentioned in the lead in. There are connections between extreme heat and public health. There are connections to be made between the climate crisis and even situations like crime, climate and education. So, helping folks to make the connections and to understand that if we solve for the climate, we will solve for a lot of these other challenges that we're experiencing on a day to day basis. And then part of it is what you're doing with your platform. The challenge, one of the challenges of this conversation over the last 30 years is that it has been led by folks who do not look like us. So this is not a conversation that we're having, at least in public forums. We're having these conversations privately. We're having these conversations in the barbershop. We're having them at the kitchen table. We're having them in the beauty salons. But we're not having them publicly. And because the conversation has been led by people who don't look like us, the ways in which the conversation has been had don't reflect views or don't reflect priorities that are necessarily important to us. So we have the responsibility and we have the opportunity to begin having this conversation and connecting it to the things we're already talking about, connecting it to the things we're already passionate about, connecting it to the things we already deal with on a day to day basis. And I think forums like this provide just those kinds of opportunities.
Well, thank you. And I mean, we are talking about an issue that really is very prevalent in our community. You term it, there's ecological apartheid. Uh, Unpack that for me. How do we arrive at ecological apartheid?
Yeah, the same way South Africa arrived at its system of apartheid government, right? This is intentional, public policy that, in America's case, we could go all the way back to 1492, but for the purposes of the climate, really started in earnest the turn of the 20th century in the Industrial Revolution, and the ways in which corporations put profit over people's lives. I mean, that's really, there's no simpler way to understand it than that. So if you look at apartheid in South Africa, it was a system based on race that told black folk where they could live, where they could go to school, what kind of jobs they could have, dictated the types of economic opportunities that were available, dictated the kinds of educational opportunities that were available. And so what we're seeing in America is somewhat of the same playbook, maybe a little bit a different play from the same playbook. So if you go back to the early 20th century with policies like redlining, policies like racial covenants, which literally moved black folk into neighborhoods. And then the FHA made decisions and in fact created an entire neighborhood rating system, A, B, C, D. And guess what neighborhoods were rated D and C? Those are neighborhoods that we were redlined into. And so then based on the rating system, decisions about what kind of investments to make in neighborhoods, whether we're going to build parks, whether we're going to plant trees, other types of infrastructure investments, those decisions were made based on the ranking of the neighborhood. And we always somehow miraculously managed to find ourselves in neighborhoods that were rated D and C. So when I talk about apartheid, it is a system, it is structural, anti-black, anti-brown public policy that has caused generations of harm. The other reason I use the terminology of apartheid is because it's more honest. When we use words like climate crisis or climate change, those designations, in my opinion, are too passive. And they produce a couple of sort of nefarious consequences, one of which is it lets the perpetrators, off the hook. What we can't possibly be held accountable for something that's happened on a global scale. And then at the same time, for folk like you and me and others of your listeners who are trying to figure out what they can do about something that's so massive, what could I possibly do about a global catastrophe? Well, if you break it down and use more honest and clear language like apartheid, then we have a playbook. We have a playbook for addressing apartheid. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was a playbook for how to dismantle the South African apartheid regime, which reached its culmination in 1994 with the election of Nelson Mandela as president. So what it does for us is it gives us tangible, sort of practical ways in which we can engage. It eliminates the paralysis that we can often feel when we're faced with something as overwhelming as a global catastrophe. But it also is more honest. And it also helps us focus our energy and attention where it needs to be focused, which is on policy. Anti-black, anti-brown public policy got us here. Unjust, inequitable public policy got us here. It is going to take just and equitable policy for us to get out of.
When we talk about public policy, obviously shaping the hearts and minds of people to let them know about some of the things that are going on, awareness, very critical. Let's talk about some of the things that people do need to be aware of. We're right now, dealing with a heat wave across the United States. And that has the potential of having some ramifications. Unpack to us how the heat, and while we're enjoying the summer and love the summer, has the potential to be quite adverse for many.
Sure. So we all love the summer, but summer is supposed to happen at the end of June. What we've seen is that summer is showing up earlier and earlier because extreme heat is rising. And extreme heat disproportionately impacts folk who look like us precisely because of the infrastructure investments that I mentioned earlier. So we live in built environments that have prioritized dark, heat-absorbing surfaces. Our roofs are covered in dark materials. our sidewalks, our streets. There's no parks, there's no tree canopy. And so we're living in an environment that is built to be hot. And it's built intentionally to be hotter for us than it is for other folk. In every city across the country, the disparity in heat between what we call low income disadvantaged communities, which are really just a nice way of saying black and brown communities, the temperature disparity is anywhere from 5 to 10, and in some cases, like Dallas, 20 degrees hotter in black neighborhoods than wealthier white neighborhoods. Same time of day, um, on the same day. So those are the realities of the built environment. This did not just happen. It's not just suddenly getting hotter just out of the blue. It's getting hotter because the environments that have been the built environment that we have been forced into over generations is hot by design. So what does that do? It creates all kinds of adverse health impacts. We have higher instances of respiratory disease. We have higher mortality rates. We have our children miss more days of school because it's too hot to learn. We have employees who miss more days of work because it's too hot to work, particularly those who work outside. So all of these as a cascading effect of adverse outcomes that we experience. And again, it is by design.
When we talk about buildings, very critical to what goes on. I want to talk about buildings and heat because there are in urban areas, as you say, some areas that are hotter, and the materials that are used in the building infrastructure. Unpack that a little bit more about the building infrastructure, the materials that are being used, and what can we do as a community to really raise our voice towards this?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second part of that question first. What we can do is to put pressure on policymakers who are making the decisions about, how to, what kind of surfaces and what kind of materials to use. So when we talk about urban settings and urban heat island, surfaces determine or surfaces drive heat. So if you have surfaces that are dark that absorb heat versus surfaces that are light and reflect heat, right, you're going to get hotter surface temperature, you're going to get hotter ambient temperature, which is the air temperature around us. And so those materials are often cheaper, at least the upfront cost is cheaper. And miraculously, when it comes to our military, we have no problem finding the money and the funding for our military. When it comes to building billionaire and subsidizing billionaire fantasy football and baseball and basketball arenas, we have no problem finding money for that through bond initiatives, tax incentives. Have no problem finding money for that. But when it comes to protecting people's lives, all of a sudden budgets get tight. We have to start looking for ways to cut. We cut education. We cut access to early childhood education. We cut free lunch. We make all of these cuts when it comes to protecting people. But when it comes to maintaining the wheels of capitalism, we got no problem finding the funding. It's miraculous. It's almost as if it was done on purpose.
I want to talk about your foundation because you got a foundation. It's called Building Up Our Youth Foundation, and the work that's going on in educating youth to really make them aware and at the same time giving them some leverage as they journey on.
Yeah, so I think for me, as I look at history, I'm a student of history, and almost every major movement that has happened, not only in this country, but around the world, has in some way, shape, or form uh, either been led by young people or heavily involved young people. And so not only the passion, but the intelligence and the ways in which young people engage the world, the ways in which young people think about things have always been critical in helping us solve some of our biggest problems. And so I was a youth pastor for 13 years. Then I was a senior pastor for about 10 years. And in my youth pastor days, I always found myself energized, always found myself drawn to the energy of youth, high school, middle school, college, young people. So we started a foundation really to harness that energy and harness that power that young people have, to train them to be not only the leaders of tomorrow, but the leaders of right now. Because the truth is, folk, I don't know how old you are, but I'm getting up in years where I don't have too many more years left to do this work, and so we got to have somebody to pass the torch to. And so we have been training, working with young folks on a number of fronts. But the climate is critical because if we're not careful, if we don't change course and do so quickly, the next generation will not have a planet to inherit.
Yeah. We talk about heat. Let's talk about flooding because the next generation's got to deal with that. There's a lot more floods that we're seeing, more now than ever before.
Hmm.
We're seeing more extreme rain in our communities. How do we deal, and what are the best things that we can do here in terms of trying to reduce flood risk? Because the flood zones, as we look at the maps are filling up with more and more flood
Yeah,
zones every year.
yeah. So storms that used to be once in a century are now happening once a year. We're breaking all kinds of records in ways that are not good. And so what we can do is to really get engaged in the community with organizations like React for Social Justice that's there in Harlem, Healthy Community Services in New Orleans, the Local Initiative Support Corporation in Jacksonville, and so many others who are laser focused on these issues and have developed programming, have developed expertise, and have cultivated relationships to address these challenges. What we can do is to find ways to get their resources. We don't need to recreate the wheel. We don't need to build something from scratch. There is an infrastructure in place in our communities, often led by folk who look like me and you, because for us, this is not an academic or theoretical exercise. For us, this is existential. If we don't do this, then who's going to do it? And if we don't do it, then we're going to be the ones. It's an evil reality that those of us who contribute the least to these issues are the ones who are most vulnerable to their deleterious impacts.
So, how are you educating in terms of that work that goes on in the community? I know you're educating communities about the issues, the awareness. Talk about
Yeah,
how receptive they are, because when we talk about climate and ecological
yeah.
issues, sometimes, those in our community, we're not really on it. I'm just going to put it like that. We're not on it until it really affects us in the pocketbook or the wallet.
But that's the thing. It is impacting us and has been for a long time. I think again it goes back to helping folk to make those connections and understand that these increasing heat waves are not they did not just arise out of nowhere. It God did not just decide to turn up the heat on us, right? That's not what's happening here. What's happening here is the result of public policy that has been enacted over generations and generations. We're talking about a legacy of environmental racism where we have been redlined into communities that are vulnerable. We have been redlined into flood prone communities. We could not live anywhere else, right? The law would not allow us to live on higher ground. So when you look at New Orleans, you look at Jacksonville, and places that are near water, in every city that's near some water, whether it's the ocean, lakes, rivers, whatever the case may be, we have been forced by policy into neighborhoods that are near those water sources and that are vulnerable and susceptible to flooding. Right? It's not an accident. And so again, we don't. There's not a lot of education that has to be done because folks have been living with this stuff for generations. Right? We're not the first generation to experience this. Our great great grandparents dealt with this. And so it's really just about getting in the community and talking with folk and having conversations. And what you find is that these folks are aware. These folks are astute. These folks are with it, so to speak. But they have often been put into places where they don't have a public platform. put into places where resources have been divested. And so it's helping to bring resource to those places. It's helping to put money in the hands of community-based organizations, neighborhood associations, as close to the ground as possible. And so that's one of the exciting things about the work that I'm doing now with Metropolitan AME Church in DC. We are putting money in the form of grants right in the hands of community-based organizations who are in these communities, who are on the ground in the streets, innovating solutions. And the thing about, and you know this from being in community yourself, the community does not need some hero parachuting in to tell the community what it needs. The community just needs resource to do what it's already been doing.
Absolutely.
And we're trying to make sure that we can get as much resource into the hands of those folks as possible.
You know, when I think about that, you're absolutely right. You know, doesn't need somebody to come in and tell us. We already know with boots on the ground what's happening. And when we know what's happening, all we need is sometimes are the resources to be able to deal with that. So from your perspective, this here. With resources, how is it playing out for you with regards to seeing resources being allocated for these particular issues?
Yeah, so I just got back from New Orleans this weekend. One of the organizations that we were able to fund has built a community rain garden, which is a combination of sort of green infrastructure technologies that allows for the return of native plant species, native wildlife, so butterflies, and it's very interesting to be in the middle of an urban setting and see like what looks like a butterfly reserve. Um, Hummingbirds and other native birds are beginning to come back to this area because it has been created to draw native plant and animal species. It also has the capacity to collect 6,000 gallons of storm water. So when these once in a generation uh, weather events that are now happening two, three times a year, instead of flooding, this rain garden captures that rainwater and then redistributes it so that it does not cause flooding. And so those are the kinds of things that communities have been doing for a long time without resource. We are blessed to provide a little bit, it's a drop in the bucket. But a wise person once told me, don't be discouraged by the drop in the bucket because every bucket gets filled one drop at a time.
That's the truth right there, and I agree with that 100%. Now,
Yeah,
for people who want to get connected, find out and engage in engage in the work, or even let me back up. I'll back up and ask another question. I'll come back to that in a second. People who want to
yeah,
get engaged in the work, what do you advise them to do in terms of really being able to have substantial traction? Because this is a
yeah.
work that really a lot of people don't embrace it or don't engage in, but we know that we deal with this on an everyday basis.
Yeah, we deal with it on an everyday basis. And because that's the case, there are organizations in every community, particularly in communities of folk who look like me and you, that are deeply engaged in this work. So, what I would say to your average listener um, who's trying to figure out what to do, right? What can I do about this issue that seems to have global implications? Um, is to understand that and put that in context, but to then engage hyper locally. There's an expression that says all politics is local, and to an extent that is true. I think that all activism is local. So if you are trying to figure out how to get engaged, do your desktop research. A quick Google search will tell you the organization or organizations, plural, that are in your community that are doing this work. And I guarantee you they need volunteers. I guarantee you they need funding. I guarantee you they need folks to participate in education and awareness campaigns. And so find those organizations, find those executive directors who are doing the work, boots on the ground, as you say, and get engaged locally because that's where the difference is made. There's so much been made about all of the stuff that's happening at the federal level, and all of that is important. But without people on the ground to make sure that that resource gets to the street, all of the stuff that's happening at the federal level and even at the state level means nothing if we don't have folk who can make sure it touches the streets where folk like you and me reside.
Yeah. Reverend John Robinson was the senior program director at Metropolitan AME Church, and we thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate you taking the time to really unpack some of this for us because it's very necessary and something that we very much need in our community. Coming us all the way out of Washington, D.C. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
All righty. And we are taking a quick break, but guess what? We'll be back with more right after this.